Hi, I'm John Street. I'm the managing editor here at campusreform.org. I have Professor Alexander Riley with me today. He is a professor of sociology at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. Professor, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, it's my pleasure, John. Thanks very much for chatting with me today.
So I know that you have called attention to an event that's being hosted at Bucknell University, and that is the invitation of former lecturer at Dartmouth College, Mark Bray. He is the author of the book called Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, and he has in the past said that violence is a legitimate response to groups such as white supremacists and other extremist groups. And you take issue with that, with Mark Bray coming to your campus. Why is that?
Well, I think it's the problem in my view is not that Mark Bray has the opinions that he has, because I am an advocate of a wide range of free expression and speech on campus and elsewhere. I certainly have no designs, and no one that I've talked to about this event has no designs to try to stop Mark Bray from speaking. I think he ought to be able to express his perspective and then get that criticized, get that responded to by other folks in a free engagement. The difficulty, so far as I see it, is that you have an orthodoxy among in certain parts of the university these days, especially concentrated in the humanities and the social sciences, where the range of speakers and the range of ideas that they're able to articulate now has moved into a territory that I think is of some concern for some folks. So Mark Bray, as you just noted, he's one of a number of people who have had at least some affiliation with universities, had appointments at some point or another at universities. I'm not even sure exactly what Mr. Bray's current status is at Dartmouth. I do know that the president of Dartmouth made a public statement distancing the institution from Bray's definition and his advocacy of Antifa. There are a number of these people who they make exactly the statement that you just made, that they say they define it as legitimate self-defense, the violence that they're essentially apologizing for against folks that they deem white supremacists, racists, fascists, etc. The difficulty is that these folks have set themselves up as the tribunal who gets to determine who exactly is a white supremacist and who is a fascist and who is a Nazi and who is and one of the things that's been going on over the last several years on campuses and elsewhere is that a lot of groups and in the left have been quite interested in trying to expand that category as much as they can. So they include, at this point, they basically include anyone who has any kind of a nationalist, patriotic political stance, for example, on immigration policy in the United States. We had an event at Bucknell just a year and a half or so ago in the spring of 2018, when a student group invited the University of Pennsylvania law professor Amy Wax to come talk a little bit about some of her work, specifically on this op-ed that she had written on the bourgeois virtues, she called it, the bourgeois values, and why in fact these were good cultural values that made it more likely that people who embraced them were going to have success in their lives, whatever their racial or ethnic identity, whatever their class identity, etc. She was when her visit was announced on campus in that spring of 2018, there was an immediate outcry on the part of a bunch of faculty and some other folks on campus and in the area. And they all denounced her, these folks who were upset, denounced her in exactly that language. They called her a white supremacist, they called her a fascist, they said that allowing her to speak on campus was the equivalent of allowing someone to come on campus and to erect a burning cross or a swastika. Now anyone who knows Amy Wax's work and has actually read Amy Wax or heard her knows that that's the height of absurdity to make those claims. And yet they made them within a framework, again, in which there are significant numbers of those people on campus who agree with that definition of what a white supremacist is. The white supremacist is anyone who will argue that there's a more or less universal set of cultural values that Amy Wax delineated these values in her piece. She said basically she's talking about things like avoid having children before you've finished your educational and your career plans, and before you've married or before you have a permanent partner. Try to avoid crime and try to avoid drug abuse. Try to be punctual. Try to be respectful to other people.
Those are things that they considered controversial.
Those were controversial bourgeois virtues, right, for some of these folks who were upset. So the problem is really is not, again, that Bray has the positions that he has. It's that there is a significant movement in the direction of an orthodoxy of opinion at lots of universities. It's much less pronounced at Bucknell, frankly, than it is at some other places, and we feel very grateful for that. We, at least at Bucknell, we have a president who very warmly and openly embraces a very wide range of debate. He is not interested and shown no interest and no inclination to try to do any censoring of invitations to campus and so forth. And we fully support that position and think that's the right position. So again, just to be very clear, no one is calling for for Mark Bray to be denied the invitation to come and speak. The problem is just that you get, at that end of the spectrum, you get the expansion of speech into clear advocacy of violence. That is, folks who are saying speech alone is not enough. In some situations, folks who are adequately defined by us as beyond the pale, they can legitimately be met with fists and with clubs instead of with speech. I invite anyone around our campus area or anywhere else to imagine a speaker who was on the political right being invited to a college campus, being invited to Bucknell or anywhere else, who was making a similar argument about, for example, what we should do. Communism, for example, communists, open apologists for communism should be beyond the pale. And we should legitimately be able to respond to them with fists and with clubs rather than with words. But let me be perfectly clear. I don't know of anybody, there are no legitimate speakers in universities who make that argument. But if you can't even imagine someone like that who argued such things being given invitations to come to speak on a campus anywhere. Sure, so this is we're really trying to point out just the problem of orthodoxy of thought in a lot of parts of universities. And my whole intention in writing about this piece was just to make it clear to potential audiences, people who might go to hear Mark Bray, to make it clear exactly what he advocates. Because I think the folks who invited him here and the folks who've organized the event are quite interested in not telling the full truth about what Mark Bray is actually up to.
And I want to go back to one of the things that we've learned here at Campus Reform is that this event has not been really advertised publicly. While the poster says that it's been that it's free and open to the public, it hasn't been advertised to the public. It's been advertised in private channels on campus, as well as, like I said, on posters throughout the campus. Is there a reason for that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I can't really speak as to why the organizers have tried to put the word out as they have about the event. It wouldn't surprise me if they at least have some knowledge that if folks, especially outside the campus community, became aware of who Mark Bray is and what positions he advocates for, if they became aware of the fact that he'd been invited to campus, some of those people might want to come to the event and to challenge him in no uncertain terms and to speak back to him. And it wouldn't surprise me, just given my own experience of how some of those folks who are behind the organizing of this event, what their attitude is to open dialogue and discussion and debate on campus. Wouldn't surprise me if they weren't all that interested in that kind of debate.
So the city,
again, there are a bunch of other events in the past that I could speak about. I'm sorry, go ahead.
The city in which Bucknell University is located, is it more of a conservative leaning town, a liberal leaning town? I'm trying to get an overall picture of what the overall response from, not necessarily just on campus, but people who live in the town, what the reaction to a former professor or a former lecturer who openly sympathizes with Antifa that promotes violence, what their reaction to that would be.
Sure. Well, just a brief sketch of where Bucknell sits. So Lewisburg is basically a town. I mean, to call it a city is in fact something of a misnomer. It's a little small college town in the middle of the state of Pennsylvania. In political terms, certainly I think Lewisburg probably leans significantly more to the left than a lot of the other surrounding area, primarily because Bucknell is here and because there are faculty here and there are other folks affiliated with the university who there's lots of research that shows that most people who work in university environments and college environments these days, especially the faculty, tend to skew pretty heavily to the left.
Sure.
That being said, though, even within Lewisburg, I think a lot of the folks who live in town who aren't directly affiliated with the university, and certainly once you get outside of Lewisburg and go into the surrounding area, neighboring towns and so forth, it's a fairly politically red part of the country. You know, central Pennsylvania is well known, I think, historically for a certain kind of cultural and political conservatism and a wariness, certainly, to the kinds of the really extremist and radical ideas that someone like Mark Bray represents. So I think this is true in a lot of universities and colleges that sit in small towns, in rural or semi-rural environments. There's a little bit of tension. There's a little bit of political, I wouldn't call it conflict so much as just, again, tension between the attitudes and beliefs of a lot of people affiliated with the university and the attitudes and beliefs of folks who are in the surrounding area. And some of that tension can be productive and can be useful. But when someone like Mark Bray is invited to campus, I think you can be relatively assured that there aren't going to be a lot of people in the surrounding community who, once they find out what he's actually advocating, who are going to support those ideas.
Another thing I wanted to touch on is, one, if you yourself are planning on attending this event, and two, if you know if whether the college has prepared any sort of security so that if, people from another political ideology do show up to this event and Mark Bray draws these Antifa type supporters, I mean, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that there is a chance that violence could break out. And is the college prepared to deal with that?
Oh, in all frankness, my view of that is I actually think real violence is unlikely at the event.
Okay.
In large part because while I believe Mark Bray will have some supporters there at the event, certainly most of them will be Bucknell faculty members and other folks who they're typically not the people who are out in the streets committing the violence in the name of Antifa that we see on the news and that we read about on some other campuses in recent years. They're basically what's become the norm for, again, a certain significant chunk of the faculty of universities and college campuses in the humanities and the social sciences. They lean very far left, much farther left, in fact, than the average left-leaning Democrat member in the broader American society. And so they have a certain ideological commitment to, especially, I think, some of the rhetoric. I mean, in my view of it, having talked to some of these folks, is that there's a certain kind of romanticism in their view of presenting themselves and also presenting Mr. Bray as morally courageous folks who are responding to evil with their moral courage, when in fact the situation is quite a lot more complicated, as I just said. And in fact, there are some elements of what it is that's going on that side in rhetoric, which are just dishonest, and they're not actually depicting the situation correctly. And certainly, I think it's absolutely unlikely that you'll find any of the conservative or other right-leaning critics of Mr. Bray who might come to the talk. I don't think there's any likelihood that they're going to do anything more than maybe challenge him in the Q&A. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see if he has any responses for them, how he deals with that. I know he's had at least some experience of that, because I've seen some of his television experiences where he talks about the Antifa book that he's written and other things. And the callers in are almost uniformly, on every program that I've seen him, almost all the callers are antagonistic to his ideas. So I suspect that'll happen as well tonight if any folks from the larger community show up.
So you mentioned that it's unlikely that people from the surrounding communities that tend to lean more conservative, at least not in the town itself, but in the surrounding communities, tend to lean more conservative. You don't think will necessarily be the majority of the audience tonight. Do you think the college did not advertise this publicly because they foresaw potentially an issue with some conservative-leaning people showing up to the events, and that could be a greater trigger to violence breaking out? Do you think that's a possibility?
Again, I can't really speak to what their intentions were. I mean, I do know if if that was anybody's intention to keep things quiet in the larger surrounding community, that intention failed, because I think the word has gotten out. And that, in point of fact, that was part of what I was trying to do, again, not only to the larger community, but more specifically within the framework of my professional responsibilities as a professor at the university. I feel a responsibility in these kinds of situations to try to provide, to the best of my abilities, some real background information on the speaker, who, again, in my view, the organizers of the talk they gave some considerable evidence that they weren't really interested in giving the full contextual background of Mr. Bray's ideas and his relationship to the larger political discourse. I mean, one of the things that I wrote about in the piece that I published on the event was I just noted that in the mainstream American political spectrum, from the right to the left, Antifa is denounced. It's not only it's not only President Trump who's denounced Antifa in no uncertain terms. The Speaker of the House, who is in the other party, has said very similar things. When Antifa rioted at UC Berkeley some time back, she had very stern criticisms to make of that group and of the idea and the ideology that, in fact, there's some legitimate realm for physical violence in the political spectrum of this country. As I said, the president of Dartmouth, of the institution at which Mr. Bray was employed, may still be employed. I'm not quite sure what his status is. Their president was very outspoken as well in saying these are not ideas that Dartmouth endorses, and in fact, we recognize them as beyond the pale of real civil political discourse. This is really, I mean, there's a big divide on this among certainly among college faculty and to some degree among the larger American public. Some people think that there are ideas and that there are political positions that are beyond the pale by definition, and typically those folks don't even want to engage them. They just use epithets to describe them. Those are racist ideas, those are fascist ideas, those are, for some other folks in the country, the ideas that are being described with those epithets are part of the mainstream discourse. And so when you get that kind of disagreement about definition, there's inevitably going to be some debate and potentially some conflict. I think the difference between those two positions is that, by and large, the respectable voices on the conservative side, on the right side, our position is we have to keep this debate at the level of discourse, at the level of discussion, at the level of arguments and ideas. You want to argue for a far left radical position in terms of where the country should be going? Make the argument. And in an open forum, we'll get an opportunity to challenge that, and we can have the debate and let the people who are listening to the debate then participate in the form of question and answer, and let people make up their minds. And again, at least some people, not all people, let's be very clear, it's not everybody on the left who endorses Mark Bray and those ideas, because as I just said, the mainstream left in the country, sure, from Nancy Pelosi on down, denounces him and his ideas at least as strenuously as the president does. But there are some folks on the left who I think are willing to entertain the notion that you have to repress some ideas. Some ideas have to be prevented from being expressed. That becomes even easier to not just articulate that position, but to potentially to put it into practice in places like universities, where again you get a certain kind of groupthink phenomena in some humanities and social sciences parts of the university, where everybody's basically on the same side. It's much easier for wrong-headed and frankly anti-democratic ideas like those of Mr. Bray to get a little wider purview than they would otherwise.
Professor, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with us about this very important topic. I really appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hi, it's Lawrence Jones with Campus Reform. If you like that video you just saw, you can donate right here to help us make more of them. And if you want to subscribe, click right here.